And yeah, that was super interesting for me because I'm just about to produce the first one at the ripe old age of 38. So you can do it any way around. Thank you to the team for asking me to come and talk to you today about MSF. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what it's like and about how to do it. But first of all, I'm going to talk to you about what it is. So this is a little girl in Biafra in 1971. There was a civil war raging. People were suffering. Little children were starving. It wasn't a new phenomenon. But there were a group of doctors and journalists that were working on this particular humanitarian crisis who felt that the existing agencies and governments weren't able to speak out about what was happening to these people. And so they formed a new organisation, Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF. And this organisation had a dual mandate. Firstly, to provide healthcare access to people in emergency humanitarian crises, regardless of race, sex, gender, and political persuasion. And secondly, témoignage, which is roughly translated as bearing witness. And it means recognizing the suffering of these people and being able to speak out about that and inform people that these people are suffering and the contributors to that suffering. So I've seen lots of pictures of little girls like this on the news, and I'm sure you have too. But back in 1971, people hadn't. The increasing ubiquity of television changed that. Suddenly, little girls like this were in people's living rooms, and people wanted to do something about it. And so they gave money, and they still do. MSF came at a time when people were seeing little girls like this and they wanted to do something about it. And it captured the imagination of the individual donor. And that, alongside some really active decision-making from MSF about the kind of funding that we accept and who we accept funding from, has given MSF probably its greatest asset, financial independence. So we have 90% of our donations coming from private donors, people like you and me, not from governments and not from big entities that have their own agenda. And that enables us to really focus on what we hope and think is the need in the humanitarian context. And that's a great liberty that we have compared to lots of other agencies and organisations that are trying to respond to humanitarian crises. So it's great, right? We're this amazing humanitarian organisation and we're providing healthcare and we're speaking out and we're independent, except, like all things in medicine, and maybe all things that involve human beings, it gets a little bit messy. It gets a little complicated. And I'm going to take you back to Ethiopia in 1984 when most of you weren't born. I was born, but I wasn't working for MSF at that time. I'm not that old. But you may know about Ethiopia in 1984. There was a big famine, and it was when Bob Geldof galvanized all those musicians. They put together Band Aid, and they created this huge international outpouring of funds. And MSF was also working in Ethiopia at that time, responding to that humanitarian crisis. And a lot of money that was coming in through aid got diverted by the government. It was utilised to forcibly relocate a lot of IDPs, and it led to the deaths of tens of thousands, if not maybe 100,000 people. And that's called the instrumentalisation of humanitarian aid. And MSF spoke out against that, and they were thrown out of the country by the government and were no longer able to provide humanitarian aid or to witness what was going on. Goma, 1994, the Rwandan genocide. MSF left. They weren't thrown out, they left of their own accord because humanitarian aid was being diverted to genocidal activities. So they walked away and left people, refugees, IDPs with humanitarian needs that were not being met. There's a lot of controversy about that. Somalia, 2009. MSF capitulated to certain demands of Al-Shabaab in order to preserve their access to provide remote emergency medical support to people inside Somalia. Some people said it amounted to paying tax to a terrorist organisation. And these are just the macro situations, the rocks and the hard places. When you work for MSF, you're making these difficult micro decisions every day that can cause harm or cause risk. And so it can be very, very difficult. And so I wanted to just put those things out there because I think it's important if you're thinking about that kind of work and humanitarianism that you understand a little bit about how complicated it can be and have thought a bit about potential harms from humanitarian aid. And I would encourage you, if you are interested, to read a little more deeply. These two books are a couple of books that are out there, but there's plenty of other things as well. So is it complicated? Yes. Can harm occur? Yes. Shall we put it in here? No. So I think that for me, these ethical challenges and dilemmas that we face in humanitarian work are part of what keeps it interesting. And it also blows out of the water the saviour complex, the hero complex that is sometimes applied to that sort of work, because it isn't like that at all. And we make a lot of difficult decisions. So that's a picture of me. I'm not 47, not yet. But MSF is 47. And this is sort of like the online dating profile for MSF. So we're independently wealthy, we're mature, we're well-known, we're respected, we're big, we're a good communicator, and we're cool in a crisis. So in 2015, which is the last the data that I've actually looked at, but we spent 1.2 billion euros. 82% of that went directly to humanitarian activities and 18% goes to fundraising, management, those kind of activities. We've been around for a long time. We've done a lot of firsts and we've made a lot of mistakes and learnt from those things and written a lot about humanitarian work, including sort of less sexy things like land cruiser maintenance in remote settings and supply chains and things like that, but things that are actually really important and keep things running. We are known, we are respected by many entities and tolerated by others, and there are exceptions to that, but we are able to manoeuvre and get things done because people know our organisation. We're big, sometimes a bit too big. It has a tendency to have an unwieldy level of discussion sometimes and a bit of bureaucracy creeping in. But there are good things about being large also. And I think that we still maintain that agility to respond quickly to an acute emergency, and we have a lot of logistic power behind us. I think we're cool in a crisis because we've got individuals who are experienced, but also institutional experience. In 2015, we had operations in 69 countries, and 190 staff from Australia and New Zealand who were making up part of our 35,000 total staff. Our biggest projects in 2015, I think, were DRC, South Sudan, and I think CAR. So all the big sub-Saharan Africa projects where you've got huge need. And then following on from that, the most sizable areas where we were working were the Middle East conflict zones, so Iraq, Syria, and we had a big project in Lebanon, which we still have. So that's sort of where most of our money goes, but all those places that are red, that's where we're working. So these are sort of the basic things. You need to be PGY3, unless you're working as a surgeon or an anaesthetist, in which case you need to be a consultant. I was PGY4 when I first started. I think it kind of depends on you, what you've done before, the project that's being proposed to you, all sorts of things, when you're going to be ready. So PGY3 is a limit. I think that having a bit more experience than that is also always useful. You need to give at least 9 months of your time. And the rationale for that is multifactorial, but I think that it takes you a long time to understand working in a context like that when you've never done it before. And it takes quite a long time to understand the organisation and what the ethos really is and the different facets of the organisation, how it works. And so to really be contributory, I think it probably takes you 9 months to really get into it and to contribute something. You need to be a permanent resident in Australia, or whichever country you are a permanent resident in will have a way that you can work for MSF through that country. Registration with APRA, no recent gap in clinical practice, and you need to have been to a developing country. So I think that there's a lot of things that are quite confronting working in a developing context or a low middle income context, and so it's you don't necessarily have to have worked in that environment, because that can be tricky to do, but you do need to have been to a low middle income country. And then we're going to spend a little bit more time on these aspects of what MSF requires. Because many of these things you will have in your skill mix already, but they are super important for MSF. Have you managed other people? Have you trained and supervised other people? And how do you think you would respond to managing people from a different culture in a stressful situation? Are you a good self-manager? How do you relieve stress? How do you motivate yourself? How do you approach grief and moral distress? And then, have you thought about what it would be like to work in an unstable area? Are you willing to accept that risk? Is it something that you've discussed with your family? Being in a place that is afflicted by war or political unrest? Team. So we all work in teams, and I'm sure everybody in this room has experience and has some excellent teamwork qualities behind them. In MSF, you'll be put together with a team of people from different disciplines, different cultures, different languages, in a stressful situation, and sometimes you're there with them 24 hours a day. And so it's a bit more like full on than being in the team in the emergency department. And so I think it's good to think about how you respond to being in a team, followership, leadership, and what you bring to a team out of hours. Like, how do you keep people's spirits up? How do you keep things light? Because those things are super important. Flexibility. So it's not like yoga, although that's always a good thing to do in the field. How flexible are you, and how willing are you to be pragmatic, to accept things that you might not normally find acceptable, to accept things having paradigm shifts quickly? Think about that a little bit. And then extended roles. When somebody's sick, when somebody's on leave, you might need to cover them. It might be something that you haven't done before. This is me in an extended role a few years ago, digging out a land cruiser. Did a lot of that in that project. Cool. So you've thought about it, you're ready, and you want to apply. Look, it's easy. The application process is easy. You go online and go to the website, and you can just apply. And then the process looks a bit like this. And it takes a few months usually to go through this process. And if at the end of this process you and MSF feel like it's going to be a good fit, then they will offer you a project. And then, if you're anything like me, your whole life will change. And the subtitle of this talk was about taking a gap year. And the problem with MSF is that it doesn't fit well into taking a gap year. And the reason for that is, just like my emergency medicine training and the training that many of you are embarking on, it's a vocation. And MSF is a new vocation. It's the vocation of being a humanitarian, which is different to the vocation of being a physician. And it's not about you. It's not about your training, your development, what kind of doctor it's going to make you into back home. It's about them. Because MSF works with some of the most vulnerable and precarious humans in some of the most difficult contexts on earth. So it's always about them. Don't try to make it fit into your life or your schedule. So if you want to take that on, and I would highly recommend it, I'm going to talk a bit about what to expect. So we touched on this a little bit already, but in the early stages of going to a project, you might do quite a lot of clinical work, especially if it's an emergency. I always like to work alongside my team and have them see me as a clinician and support them in that bedside role. But a lot of what you do is supervision and management and training and really boring stuff like writing rosters, and people get really upset about the rosters. The same, everyone's the same all over the world. So yeah, like get some experience doing this. So especially if you're early on in your career, and I was PGY4 when I went, and I didn't really have experience of doing this, and I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't know how to manage people. And get the best out of them and make them feel safe in the team. And so I made mistakes. So I think, just be aware that most of what you do, or a lot of what you do, is going to be this. Okay? Changeability. So MSF is inherently a chaotic entity, and that chaos or changeability, as I've called it here, can be disorienting, and I think it's something that I wasn't fully prepared for. And I think I'm talking about things like, so you might get given a project in a country and you go there and actually you arrive and they're sending you to a different project in a slightly different role, and it's just that I'm already going to a new situation and it's a bit stressful, and then that happens. I think it's not easy to always deal with that. Another example is you might be fully engaged in your project, you've got a lot of great things happening, and there's a security incident and you all get evacuated and you have to leave them. So there's things like that. Just be aware. That's what it's like. And that's tricky. But it can lead to innovation. And I think that weather is always a chaotic issue in MSF, and it often keeps us from being able to do what we want to do, but there's usually a way around it, and I think that innovation can be very energizing and fun when you have a team and you're like, okay, this isn't working, we need to do something new. Working with MSF is a very emotive experience. I think medicine in general can be emotive, but particularly in some of the contexts where we're working. Frequently joy, and the excitement of making a difference, and the fun and awesomeness of having a big multicultural team of people, and then some less positive emotions like sadness and loss and moral distress for all the things that you can't fix about the context that you're working in, or all the things that don't work that should, and all of these issues. So you need to think about how you can utilize all the skills that you already have in medicine to address the perhaps more heightened experiences that you might have in these kind of contexts. It's very disruptive to your life, to normal life, at least until you have MSF as your normal life. It's disruptive to your relationships, your career, your cultural stability, I think, is because you don't really belong anywhere anymore, especially when you've been doing it for a while, and that can be quite tricky. So I think I've developed over the years strategies to deal with that, and you will too if you decide to pursue this, but just be aware that it is disruptive. There's risk. There's obvious risks. If someone says to you, will you go and work in Syria, and these are the risks associated with that, then you accept those risks or not, and you choose to go to a different project with less prescient risks. But there's also more insidious risks to your physical and mental health, as in medicine in general, that I don't think that MSF is as switched on as the medical community to well-being and these issues, but it's something that we're working on, and it's something that I personally work on when I'm leading a team or running a project as a key issue. So there is personal responsibility, there's collective responsibility, but those things certainly exist within MSF, those risks. So career-wise, yes, you can do what I've done, which is I work for MSF, but I also have a job here, and I haven't got any direction for you about how that exactly worked out, but I have gone intermittently with MSF and then intermittently being here. You can work for MSF full-time. I have a lot of respect for people who do that. I can't do that. But these are the kind of jobs that you can do. So when you first go to the field, you'll be a medical doctor or nurse, and you'll be a clinician, and you'll train a small group of national staff, and you'll be working on a specific area. Then you, after a few missions, can become medical team leader, where you're responsible for the medical strategy of the project, or the project coordinator, where you're responsible for the whole project. The medical coordinator is responsible for all the projects in that country, and they sit in the capital. And then the health advisor is responsible for 4 or 5 countries, and they sit in one of the headquarters in Europe. E-desk, the emergency desk, is our sort of super experienced cohort of emergency people who respond to the most acute, most difficult emergencies quickly. And then specialist advisors, so maybe you become a consultant in TB and you then decide that you want to go and work for MSF, then you can be a consultant and advise on technical aspects of TB management, for example. And anaesthetists, surgeons, you need to be a consultant because you're doing usually complex war surgery. Obstetrics, paediatricians need to have a good experience base. You can go as a registrar. EDICU, mental health, all of these areas are growing in MSF. The Manson Unit and Epicentre are our epidemiological research units in London and Paris, and CRASH is the social science unit, and the MSF does a lot of research, operational research, and now we're currently engaged in our first randomised controlled trial in XDR-TB. That's exciting. Infectious diseases, we do, as well as humanitarian emergencies, we do neglected diseases. So TB, HIV fall into those categories, cholera in lots of places. Logistics and management. So if you want to leave medicine and go into diplomacy and logistics and these other areas, advocacy that in MSF, then you can. So I got to do a whole bunch of things, and I still get to do a whole bunch of things with MSF, a very diverse range of incredible experiences. And I also had a lot of impact, MSF also had a lot of impact on my personal life. And so, in conclusion, working with MSF, I would highly recommend it. But it's not without its medical, ethical, and personal challenges. And it's a vocation. and I wouldn't undertake it lightly. Thank you.